Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. Today's video is going to be a review of this lens, which is the Fujinon XF 35mm f1.4R lens, and specifically in thinking of a review in regards to how it performs as a street photography lens. So in this video, I'm going to do some different things. First of all, there's not going to be a slideshow with music. I'm going to talk about each of the photos. If you would like to see all of the photos, there is a link below for the album on Flickr, so go take a look at that. Also, I will include chapter markers below for the different segments of this video. So what I want to do is talk about kind of the context of this lens, both in the big picture of the Fuji ecosystem. Also want to talk about my personal use and experience with this lens, and then also think about just kind of in general, anytime we talk about gear, remembering that it's very personal. So we'll start this video with some context and history, and by that I mean looking at how many different 30-ish millimeter lenses Fujifilm makes. And there's 4 of them. So why is that? Well, I think the reason for that is because on an APS-C sensor like the Fuji X series cameras, 30 millimeters-ish, 30 to 35, is approximately in the neighborhood of about a 50 millimeter lens, which is kind of the standard documentary focal length lens that's been traditionally used. Additionally, it approximates the field of vision of our human vision, so it's kind of a field of view we're used to seeing. So that's one reason I think that this focal length is so popular. Another thing to consider is there's lots of different use cases and maybe specialized use cases that folks might have around this type of lens, so maybe that's another reason there's so many. One focal length, many options. So let's take a look at the options that are available in the approximately 30 to 35 millimeter focal length range from Fujifilm. So we start with this lens, the Fujinon XF 35mm 1.4R, which retails for $600 US, weighs about 6.5 ounces, and it was introduced in 2011. That's the lens we're going to talk about today. Next came the 35mm f2 RWR at about $400 US. A little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, and it came out in 2015. Next up, we have the XF 33mm f 1.4R LMWR. So we notice as we're progressing through these, we're getting more features. The linear motor is quieter and faster. The f1.4 obviously is a lot of light. And then we're also getting to a heavier lens, more expensive. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Then next we have the 30mm macro f2.8 at about $600 that was introduced in 2022. I have a video about that lens. I quite like that lens. I'm a big fan of macro and close-up photography, so having a kind of a general purpose focal length that could also do macro is a big hit for me. So let's talk a little bit about these lenses. The 33mm that was recently introduced in 2021 was designed to be pretty optically perfect, I think. It was designed to be sharp, fast, and to do all that when you design a lens, from what little I understand about designing lenses, that it involves some compromises in size and making your lens larger and heavier. Going back to 2011 with the smaller and lighter 35mm, this lens was never, I think, designed to be optically perfect. And that, I think, is why there's such a mythology that has kind of developed around this lens. If you read reviews, watch videos about this lens, everybody says how magical it is. So as people talk about how magical this lens is, when I've used it, frankly, I haven't noticed that. Mostly. I'll show you a couple examples where I kind of start to see it in a moment. So that use case for this specific lens, especially at f1.4, it does start to do something that's a little hard to define, and I think that's what this lens was designed for. It was designed to have character. It was designed not to be perfect, sharp, corner to corner, all that stuff that is easy to talk about when you look at charts and graphs and things. But having a personality, having character in a lens is what this lens, I think, was really designed for. And it matched well with early Fuji cameras, and it, I think, is a great benefit to this lens. Now, having said all that, let me give you a disclaimer. I haven't used this lens a whole bunch, even though I've had it almost 10 years. The main reason for that is I'm a zoom guy. You know that, if you've watched this channel for any length of time. And the second reason is my wife has mostly used this lens. It's been on her camera. It's small, it's light, lets in a lot of light. She does more portrait photography when we do events together, especially weddings. This is a great lens because it's inconspicuous. When it's on your camera, you kind of disappear. So she uses this lens quite a bit, and she gets really good results with it. So I think it works really well for that. So let's segue into talking about street photography with this lens. And spoiler alert, for street photography, my opinion, I don't think there's anything super special about this lens unless you're always photographing at f1.4. And knowing that there's some limits to this lens. So let's start with the myth, the magic of this lens. We'll look at some photos that I think kind of demonstrate that, and then we'll talk about some of the limitations on this lens. So let's take a look at some of the magical moments this lens could produce, and I'll talk about a few of the things I noticed along the way. So when I was out making photos with this lens, I did something a little different in that I went to Kirkland, Washington. It was a beautiful day, and I wanted to go to the waterfront. I just needed to see some water rather than all the glass and steel I've been looking at for the past few weeks in Bellevue, which I like, but I needed a change of pace. So a little smaller city, the downtown area is a little more kind of California beach vibe than city vibe, so urban vibe. So that's what we're gonna get. First photo here is of some tables outside a coffee shop, bright red color, all that good stuff. So high contrast. This lens does really well in that situation. No issues. Autofocus worked well. Moving on. Another photo is this guy of a bunch of chairs, and I like this. I mean, we got nice sharpness in the corners. All these photos I think are f4, f5.6, which is a pretty typical aperture you'll use on a sunny day for street photography. The f1.4 is mostly when you're in darker environments and you want to have separation, blur of background. So again, here's what I mean by that. In street photography, oftentimes you want, most of the time I should say, the typical situation is you want context. You want most of the frame to be in focus. So you're generally speaking not using the larger apertures, the smaller numbers. So in that case, you lose some of the special qualities of this lens, the f1.4, and specifically how it looks at f1.4. So let's go back to the photos. So just another view of that. You can get some separation, some blur, even at the kind of mid apertures of 5.6 with this lens, which is something I do like, some foreground and or background blur. So that looks good. Again, this lens does really well. It's got good sharpness, good detail, good contrast, good textures, good character to it. Especially in these, I think these kind of gritty situations, I like how it looks quite a bit. Also, my edit leans into that a little bit, so it's a good match for that case. This kind of creepy mannequin, the sun was hitting it just right, so of course underexposed a little bit just to get the light on the mannequin. Everything else kind of fades to black, and yeah, you can accentuate the vacant stare of the mannequin. So the next two photos, what I want to do is show, this photo was taken at f5.6 of these folks on the bench with their golden retriever. And then the next photo, I changed the composition a little bit and I switched to f1.4 because I had a thought that that would be the trick, the magic sauce to making this lens magical. So here's the f1.4. Yeah, so I think, in my opinion, that f1.4 aperture at almost any compositional arrangement is what adds the extra bit of magic and myth-making quality to this lens. There's something that looks pretty cool about this lens at f1.4 in my opinion. It just really helps, creates a little separation. Plus the background blur is really pleasing. I like it quite a bit. So here's another example. Someone had arranged a bunch of crow feathers on the beach like this kind of little Stonehenge, almost a monument. And again, this is at f1.4. Again, watch the background blur. It's nice and I think pleasing, pretty quiet. And you get nice separation and transition from out of focus to in focus. So I quite like that. And I think that's what makes this lens special, is when you photograph at f1.4, you get that separation. But to do that, in order to get something that leverages the special personality and characteristics of this lens, it applies best in certain compositional situations. So you need to be relatively close to your subject and or have some physical separation from the subject to the background so that you can get that background magic happening that this lens, I think, is what makes this lens famous, mythical, whatever you want to call it. So to get all the benefits of this specialness, it limits you to certain compositional choices. Otherwise, it becomes, I think, a very nice and lovely 35mm lens, but it's missing some of the magic if the composition isn't complementing the characteristics and character of this lens. Do you like what I did there with the 3 C's? Yeah, sometimes they happen just in my brain as I'm talking. So that's a couple thoughts on this lens. So now that we've talked about the magic of this lens and the mythology that's developed around it, and at least in my opinion, why that is so, let's talk about the reality of using this lens and the experience of making photos. The photos themselves I really like, but for me personally, there's a couple personal things that make this lens not quite as enjoyable to use for me. And here's what they are. They both involve autofocus. The first thing is the autofocus is slower. And I know we're talking microseconds. We're talking a half a second, but it's the impression of the amount of time it takes to do the half press and then have the autofocus do its thing. It feels like a lot longer time. So it makes the photo experience a little less pleasant for me personally. I know I'm picky. The other thing that's around autofocus is it's a little loud, so you can hear it. And even when you're in continuous autofocus, it is making a lot of noise. Even if the subject isn't moving, there's a lot of motor noise going on. This was one of Fuji's original designs. Again, I think the emphasis in designing this lens was on character, and everything else took a backseat to that. In addition, I think they wanted a small and light lens because this was introduced along with the X Pro 1. So it had some different parameters in its design that determine how it functions. So let's talk about a couple other things related to focus, and I'll show you an image or two to help with that conversation. So in this photo, I was photographing and focusing on the spider web in the sun right here, and it was moving a little bit. And this is where I really noticed with continuous autofocus that it's pretty noisy. I mean, it's only I can hear it as the photographer because it's close to my ears, but it's noticeable. It becomes a little distracting. Again, it's part of the experience of using the lens that can be a distraction and detraction from enjoying using that lens. That's my experience. The second thing I noticed with this lens is I was photographing the silhouette of this gentleman sitting in the bank drive-thru, and I had face eye detect on, and it was activating and showing a face, but with this lens, where it was focusing, it was on the silver van in the background. This lens saw that silver van as a face. Nope, that wasn't the face in the photo. So I turned it off, and then I was able to just, move the focus point to his silhouette, and that worked better. So again, those aren't deal breakers, but they are realities of using this lens. So there's trade-offs. You get a lens with character and personality, but you trade off some slower autofocus and noisier autofocus. Is that a deal breaker for you? Only you will know. Also, at $600, it's a little on the more expensive side. If you prefer your lenses to have quiet autofocus and be a little even smaller and have a little more sharpness to them, the 35mm f2, from what I understand, I have never used it, is supposed to be optically superior and both technically superior in autofocus performance as well. Before I get to the final thoughts I have on this lens in regards to using it for street photography, I'm going to include a couple photos at the end. While I was out that day, some wildlife stuff was happening with a butterfly and a crow and a duck. So I got out the 70-300 and made a couple photos of those. I'll include those at the end of the video. So my overall thought on this lens for street photography is it would not be my first choice. While I like the image quality, the autofocus issues, both for like face eye detect and continuous autofocus, are enough of a problem and distraction for me that it just gets in the way of me enjoying using this lens. Having said that, if I was doing an event or I was doing night street photography, where f1.4 would be handy, I might pick this lens up in that case. Or if I was doing portrait, things I can work slower, or where I needed and wanted the characteristics of the personality of this lens at f1.4. Street photography, not so much. Bright daylight stuff when you're at f5.6, it's a nice lens. It works really, really well, but you lose some of that special magic of this lens, in my opinion. So if you're looking for a lens with some personality, some character to it, especially if you can find one used or rent one and try it and see how it fits with your type of photos, then give this guy a try. It is unique. It's different. It does have some shortcomings, as I mentioned them, but just like most things in life, there's nothing perfect. So give it a try and see what you think. Coming up here, I'm going to have some photos, as I mentioned, from the 70-300 while I was out at Kirkland, just to give something a little different, kind of a PS, a postscript to this video. So stay tuned for those. They're coming right up, and I'll talk through. There's only, I think, 4 of them. I'll talk through them as well. First photo here, this crow, I think he got all kind of wet and got a little scraggly. So this was kind of fun. Again, speaking of personality, this photo of this crow has a lot of personality. So something cool happened while I was at the beach, and there was this swallowtail, I think is the kind of butterfly, floating around. And we don't get a lot of butterflies around here, at least not traditionally. So I kind of paid attention to this butterfly for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then he or she flew in front of the little monument of crow feathers, and I got this photo. So after making this photo with the pretty modern XF 70-300 and then going back to the 35mm f1.4, the autofocus performance difference was very, very noticeable in the 35mm being slower and less confident in what it would do for me. So again, that's another factor in considering my opinion of this lens. Here's another close-up of the butterfly on the beach. He's nomming down on something, or she. But again, the 70-300 at 300mm, I think I'm about 1.5 feet, 2 feet away. And then last but not least, a mallard, just doing duck things, eye to eye with a mallard. So I really enjoy that 70-300. It's one of my favorite lenses. This 30mm macro is also becoming one of my favorite lenses. While I've had this lens, this 35mm 1.4, the longest of almost all my lenses, it's one of the ones I've used the least, and as I've discussed in this video, now you know why. So there you have it, one man's opinion, somewhat rambling, about the 35mm 1.4 and my modern experience of using it, plus the bonus of some 70-300mm photos. As always, I'd appreciate your comments. If you have your own experience, thoughts, opinions on the 35mm 1.4, please leave that down below where the comments go. I'd really appreciate a conversation with you. Also, if you get a chance, if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button. That helps a lot. Thank you for that. And do the subscribe thing, because there'll be more videos about lenses and street photography and all sorts of other stuff coming up in the future. So until I see you in a future video, I hope you stay safe and stay well and have fun creating photos. Bye for now.